whose research examines associations between social networks and health across the life course. And Holly is in the final stages of a PhD researching adolescent self-harm and social networks, doing some really fascinating work about the links between social networks and self-harm. So very much looking forward to hearing about social network analyses. Please feel free to add any questions and reflections in the chat throughout the session. There'll be a time at the end to pick these up in questions and answers. And if you've got any questions at the end, then please do please do kind of raise them at the end, and we'll try to make time to cover them. So with that said, I think I now hand over to Molly to kick us off. Thanks very much, Molly.
Sure, thank you, Craig. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see the slides and can you hear me? All right, great. So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. I'm really excited, as always, to talk about network analysis. So I'll say first that I'm going to talk a little bit and then I'll hand it off to Holly. But if you have questions that don't make it into this session, you can feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to chat further about social networks. So my goal for today is really to have this be a beginner-friendly introduction to networks. So hopefully you'll learn some of the key terms, the type of data and research questions where network analysis might be appropriate, and then Holly will give you a specific example with the REACH study that hopes to make this all tangible. So first, why should we bother? Why is it worth learning new techniques, learning all of these terms, learning these different theories, to be able to, to answer specific research questions? So practically, I think that our lives are relational, and so our theories and our data need to be relational as well. So social networks allows us to theorize and measure concepts about how individuals are interrelated or how ideas and entities are interrelated. So I'm a social networks and health scholar, so a lot of my examples will be about health today. So for example, if we're talking about health, we know there are many, many ways that social relationships matter for physical and mental well-being at any stage and age across the life course. So we could talk about social isolation, social support, social control of behaviors, relationship quality, etc. So a lot of our theories and concepts are presupposing different types of connections with others, or perhaps the risks of lacking those connections with others. So our ability to examine the structure of how people or other entities are interrelated could be really important for examining health outcomes or other outcomes. Increasingly, we are able to test what we've long theorized. So today, thank you to data availability and computational power and programs, we're able to do many more things in social network analysis that were long theorized, but just not possible to test very well in previous decades or even centuries. We've been theorizing about social relationships for a very long time. So now we have the tools to be able to test what we've been thinking about for quite some time. So very practically, what is a social network? At the base level, it's social ties between and among a set of actors. Normally, we're talking about some type of social relationship between people, but that doesn't need to be the case for it to be a network, particularly if you're taking an interdisciplinary view, thinking about network analysis in general, not just social networks. But for some examples, very often, and in the data that Holly will talk about today, we're talking about friendships among teenagers in schools, but we could also talk about bullying. So it doesn't need to be a positive relationship per se. We could talk about sexual partners. We could talk about caregiving in older adults. And we could have networks that aren't necessarily of human actors. So we could have networks that are correlations among symptoms for diagnoses and clusters of diagnoses, for example, or members who are shared across clubs to have networks of organizations. Or if we have different politicians supporting different policies, we could have networks of shared political support or networks of politicians in that way. So this generalizability is a bit of a blessing and a curse. It can be helpful, and it's exciting that anything could be a network, or we could apply this relational perspective and this relational toolkit if we have relational data. But it also makes it very challenging when there's so much variation in what's measured. There's a lot of jargon in this subfield, and it can be challenging even when you're used to the terminology to figure out exactly what is being measured or being interpreted. So hopefully today's intro provides you a bit of a start on that path. At the most fundamental level, you need two components to have a network. So first, we're talking about nodes, or often when you're coding in programs today, these are called vertices. So these are the actors or the units. And then we have edges. So those are the ties or connections between the nodes. So in our examples before, if we have friendships connecting adolescents, obviously the adolescents are the nodes. So the circles here would be all the different adolescents that we've interviewed, and the lines between them would be friendship nominations. Or it could be bullying among classmates, or confidants, people who discuss important matters with older adults. Or again, it doesn't need to be a social relationship. These could be family members and phone calls if we have data about cell phone use, for example. Within nodes, then, we often use terminology that distinguishes between ego and alter. So ego would be the focal actor or respondent, and alter would be the other nodes connected to ego, or the named person. So this is just like terms like I and you. The perspective depends entirely on, whose perspective you're taking, or the who you're focusing on, and it's more often this kind of rhetorical device of focusing on ego and talking about, the behaviors of ego's alters, for example. But these terms are used very often, so I think it's important to kind of know what they're getting at. And then we also want to know information about our nodes. So beyond just how people are connected, very often we want to know other things about them for our research questions. So we call this information attributes. Any other information we have about our nodes, their gender, race, ethnicity, certain behaviors, for example. We can include that information in our research questions as well as node attributes. We can also have attributes of edges. So we might know information, for example, about the quality of a relationship. So not just are you connected to this person, but how much do they increase your stress, or how much do they support you? Or how often do you talk to this person? How often do you call or video chat this person? So we can have information about the quality of ties, and we can even apply weights to ties to try and differentiate between different, say, strengths of relationship or frequency of interaction, for example. So point being that we can include all of this information about characteristics that might be relevant for research questions, and this is typically referred to as attributes. So if those are kind of the key ingredients to having a network, then I want to take a step back and think about, well, what are the main types of research questions that we're asking with networks? If anything can be a network, how should we think about networks? And I think we could categorize three really broad categories for types of social network analysis questions. First, we could talk about networks as pipes. So maybe our focus is on what's flowing through a network. Maybe we're interested in diffusion or shared behaviors or peer influence. So questions like, do peers influence substance use? Or are depressive symptoms contagious? These are focused on what could flow through the network, and this idea of kind of networks as pipes. The next kind of shorthand category would be networks as positions. So maybe we're not as interested in what's flowing through the network, but really we think that networks create a structure that individuals occupy a position within. So we might want to know who's the most important in this network, or who is the most central in this network, or does spanning different friend groups increase mental distress? Does isolation predict suicidality, etc.? So it's something specific to the positions that individuals or nodes occupy that we theorize will have some sort of effect on our outcome. And then we could think about the network as an outcome itself. So what creates the network structure that we observe, or how could we describe this network? So for example, our adolescent friendship network shaped by similarity in depressive symptoms, or to what extent does gender shape substance use networks? So really thinking about that social structure of the network as the main outcome. We have many types of network data that can get to these conceptual questions, but there's two that are the most common and most popular. So first would be ego-centric data, or sometimes just called ego networks for short. So this is when we have one respondent's connections, but only from their perspective. So if you're familiar with the SHARE data in Europe, the GSS in the US, or other, a lot of other surveys have taken on these similar ego network questions now. But if you imagine, okay, we interview 10,000 different people and we ask them who they speak to about important matters, we've got 10,000 little different disconnected networks. It doesn't kind of come together and create this whole web. So if I'm interviewed and I say, you know, I speak to my husband, my mom, and my friend about important matters, the researchers don't go survey my husband, my mom, and my friend, right? They're not included in the survey. So you've only got my perspective on those relationships. So that's egocentric because we only have ego's view. This data is relatively easy to collect, right? Fairly easy to include in a standard survey. And yes, it's just ego's perception, but perceptions are really important, particularly for health. And if you're lucky, ego can also report on relations between alters and attributes of alters. I say if you're lucky because it can often be a kind of exhausting task to report on all of the features of alters. But if the survey has included it, it really gives you a lot more that you can do with ego network data. So for example, if I'm not just asked who I talk to, right? And I say, oh, I talk to my husband and my mom. And then the next question would be, well, do they talk to each other? And so we'd have kind of a connecting tie between them as well. So the challenge here is it's all from ego's perspective. So we don't follow up with alters. We don't know how they perceive the network. We don't know how accurate ego is in reporting relationships between alters or their attributes. And so we also have limitations in what structure can be observed because we've got these kind of separate little bubbles of networks rather than one big structural web of interconnections. So we know size, we might know the density of the network if we know whether or not the alters talk to each other. So we can then measure if the alters know each other, if it's a more cohesive or dense network compared to more fragmented networks. We might have information about attributes. So if we ask, you know, about people's political views, we know what proportion of ego's network has the same political views or what proportion of their network is female, etc. But that's about it for ego network data in terms of the structure that could be measured or structure in combination with attributes. The other main type of data is sociocentric or sociometric. So this is when instead of just having these separate pockets of networks for each respondent, we're trying to understand the entire web of networks within a given setting. So we're trying to interview everybody within that setting, within some boundary that we draw, and understand how they are connected to each other. So if we return to the example of trying to observe adolescent friendships, we'll ask each adolescent to name their close friends in their grade, and then we can survey every student in their grade and then match those names together to get one overall web of social relations, like is represented here in this kind of toy demonstration network. So that gives us much more structure and interconnection than just the egocentric data. And so that's really a benefit. There are so many more measures we can observe about how things might flow through the network, right? It's not really useful or possible, excuse me, to measure diffusion in ego networks, but we could measure that in sociocentric networks. And there's just many more types of structure that could be observed. We also have self-reports rather than just ego's perceptions. And so that might be particularly important for stigmatized or more internalized behaviors or states. So I might not have a good guess of my friend's depressive symptoms, but if we have sociocentric data and they also took the survey, then they gave their own self-report that is then matched in our network data rather than relying on ego's perceptions of those behaviors. So that might be really important depending on what you're studying. We also can distinguish the direction of ties. So this doesn't necessarily make sense for every type of relationship you might be studying, but sometimes it makes sense to distinguish tie direction. So, you know, I might name Holly as a friend and she might not name me back. And that's interesting social information. So there we could talk about sent and received ties in some cases. But it can be really challenging to collect these data. It's time consuming, it's expensive, it's quite the data task to try and match the respondents within the setting, it's also hard to try and define your setting or define the boundary of your setting. So for example, if we want to interview adolescent friendships, should we try to make a network for every class or every grade or year in school or for the entire school? Because people might have friendships outside of their year in school, right? But people might have friendships outside of school. So can we interview the entire community, right? Most of the time we don't have the resources to do that. So you have to kind of figure out where it makes sense to draw that boundary. There are a few studies, I think I've seen some community-based studies in Sweden where they do try to interview everyone in a given community and create the sociocentric web for that whole region. So it's possible, but it's quite expensive and quite rare. There's also many more types of network data that I'm not going to discuss today, but I wanted to include them in slides. So if these are something that you've heard about or the egocentric and sociocentric data don't seem to quite get you where you need to go, here's some other terms that might help you think about different types of network data. So if we think about this sociocentric network data, what can we examine if we have this type of data? So first, never underestimate the power of description and visualization, particularly if it's something that isn't typically shown in terms of network structure. It can be really helpful just to have that structure mapped out. And it could even be helpful if you're doing, some kind of community intervention, for example, to be able to show what the network looks like can be very powerful. If we go back to this idea of networks as pipes versus networks as positions, if we have sociocentric network data, we can examine diffusion. So we can look at, say, how a new app spreads through use in a school, or we could look at selection and influence. So do our behaviors change our social ties? Do our social ties change our behaviors, for example? If we think about networks as positions, we're very often talking about centrality measures. So this is the way of measuring what individuals in a network are in particularly important positions. And I think there's well over 200 of these measures that are used just in social science networks research. So there's many, many ways we could mathematically try to determine who is the most important or who is central in a key way in the network. So of course, I'm not going to get into all of them today, but just to let you know that there are many existing measures that get at different types of positions in the network. So some popular ones would be in degree. So if you have directed data, these are received ties. And if you have sent ties, that would be out degree. If you don't have directed data, so it's just, there's no sent and received, it's just tie or no tie, then it's simply degree, and it would be the count of ties. So if we look at this highlighted node in green, they're receiving 4 ties, they're sending 1 tie, so they've got an in degree of 4 and an out degree of 1. So basically looking at popularity or sociality, kind of sent and received ties in that way. We can look at isolation, so who is not connected in our network. We can also look at betweenness. That's a common measure. So that's, are there individuals who are bridging different groups in the network or who are on paths that are connecting other nodes in the network? And we can talk about density. That's another very common measure. So that's how cohesive or tight-knit is a network. And density, again, could be at kind of the ego network or sociocentric level. We could talk about density for the people that a node is directly tied to, for a node's direct alters, or we could talk about density overall in the network. Another group of questions, it's what I would very scientifically refer to as clumpiness. So how many groups are in the network, or how is the network characterized in terms of group structure or clustering? So sometimes you see this called the small worlds pattern. There was kind of a famous article written in the 70s, I think, that used that term. So that still comes up quite a bit. Sometimes it's called modularity or clustering. So this is essentially what different groups we observe, or to what extent is the network kind of characterized by separate groups versus more cohesive. And then at the real forefront of networks modeling these days, at least in terms of social networks, are simulation-based models that get more inferential. So not just descriptive, but really trying to make inferences about the network structure and processes we observe. So there's a lot of new models that are cropping up in this area, but 2 of the most popular ones are stochastic actor-oriented models and exponential random graph models. So stochastic actor-oriented models, or SAOMs, SABMs, sometimes they're called Siena models. We really have a problem with giving everything multiple names in network analysis, but these are models that really try to get at selection and influence. So if we have this web of network data, can we observe how behaviors are shaping ties over time, how social ties are shaping behaviors over time, and do we see a coevolution of ties and behaviors? So for example, do depressive symptoms affect friendships? We might expect that people are friends with others who have similar depressive levels to themselves. So do we observe that in the network, but then do friends also affect depressive symptoms? We might expect our friends affect our mental health. And so how can we model these two processes together? And that's really the strength of these stochastic actor-oriented models. The other popular inferential network model is the ERGM family of models. And there's many types of ERGMs these days. They tend to make a new one and add a new letter on to the beginning. So there's longitudinal ERGMs or temporal ERGMs are called tergums, and there's bipartite ERGMs that are bergums, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of ways you could specify this type of model, and these are really geared at what predicts the network we observe. So networks as the outcome, and what are the social processes that lead to this network? So for example, if we're interested in how does physical health shape networks in adolescence, we can measure that with an ERGM, and we can kind of control for all of this other social stuff we know is happening all the time. So we know that a friend of a friend is more likely to be a friend. We know that homophily on gender, so having friends who are the same gender as you, really shapes networks in early adolescence. And so we can kind of measure those factors, control for them to get a more precise measure for other characteristics of interest. That's really the strength of the ERGM. But again, there's many subtypes of ERGMs that might be more specific for, say, multi-level data, multiplex data, et cetera. So what are some of the tools for network analysis? I do want to back up 1 second and note that very often we're getting network measures and we're treating them just like any other variable in regression. So we're using our typical statistical programs we'd be using anyway for any other type of non-network analysis. That's often what we do for ego-centric data. So for example, the size of an individual's network is just one more variable in our analysis. With sociocentric data, there's some concerns of non-independence with this, right? So my report of my friends might affect my friends' values of their reports of their friends, right? It's generally not a problem if you have a large data set, and there's some other kind of tricks you can use to address this network autocorrelation or to ensure that your results are robust to it. So for some people, this would be a no-go. It's not something you should do. I think it's perfectly fine if you have enough data and you're certain that network autocorrelation isn't driving results. So we could say, measure the size of individuals' networks or their popularity, and it's just one more characteristic in our regression or our path analysis or what have you. Undoubtedly, the biggest challenge is often data cleaning, particularly for sociocentric data. So first of all, data collection is its own challenge. There's quite a bit of work in matching respondents, different types of missing data. Like what if people name somebody and you don't find them as someone on the roster, or they give an inappropriate nomination, like Mickey Mouse is their best friend. What do we do with data like that? But if we kind of set aside data collection, once you have your data cleaned, you have to put it into some kind of structure where we know what the nodes and edges are to be able to construct the network. So this is often an adjacency matrix. So if we look at this little toy network, each individual node has their own row and column, and then the cell at the intersection of the row and column indicates whether or not there's a tie. Or sometimes that gets way too big. If we have, thousands of people, having a matrix that's 10,000 by 10,000 is just hard for a computer to handle, or at least a normal computer to handle. So we might use an edge list instead. So this is getting at the same idea. So here, each row is an edge. So person A named person B, person A also named person C. And you'll see how that's reflected in the arrows up here in this little toy ego network. So either data format is fine. Holly's going to give you more detail about what they look like in the reach data. But the point is you have to kind of clean your data, get it into one of these two formats, and then you can use networks programs. I want to give a shout out to Network Canvas. It's a new program for data collection that is really excellent at kind of giving respondents a visual data collection tool. So again, I'm not getting into data collection, but that might be helpful. Two other kind of traditional popular programs for network analysis are UCINet and PIAC. These are older and they're more kind of point and click focused. So they do give you output that can be used for replicability, but most of the time you're kind of choosing from menus and you know, they have their own kind of special data formats and quirks and things like that. But the point of these is they're quite accessible in terms of you don't have to know a lot of specific coding to be able to just take an adjacency matrix, use one of these programs and get some interesting networks information. So if you're not somebody who does a lot of quantitative methods coding, these might be great starting points for working with data. And they're free. So it's also a low literal cost for starting to work with them. Mostly these days, though, we're looking at networks in R. So R has some basic network packages. There's two packages that are the most popular for sociocentric data, so StatNet and iGraph. They're both good. People generally use both or one or the other. It kind of is just a disciplinary tradition. iGraph, I think, is a little bit better for visualization. StatNet is better if you're going to end up doing ergoms because they're made by the same people, so you just learn the same kind of syntax. And my only caution is that sometimes they measure things differently. So you could have the same measure like closeness in StatNet and iGraph, and they might be measured as the exact opposite of each other, as the exact inverse measure. So you just have to be very careful with these packages to try and be sure that you're reading about how they're measuring what they're measuring and how they're interpreting, how you should interpret it. And there's many more specialized packages in R. So if you want to do ego networks, there's ego R. If you want to do epidemiological networks, there's epimodel, relational event models, two-mode networks. So many more that I can't even list on this page, and including the two programs that do the inferential type of models that I talked about before. So there's the ERGM programs that host everything for the ERGM family of models. And then RCNA runs the stochastic actor-oriented models. So that's kind of where you need to go to R and to use these packages if you want to be doing that type of modeling. Okay, now I have all sorts of resources put in the slides. I've also shared slides with the folks at the center so that it can be shared with the recording and other information. So I'm not going to talk through all of these, but I do want to highlight that the International Networks Conference, it tends to be in the US every other year and then somewhere in the world on the opposite years. And it happens to be in Edinburgh next summer. So it would be in June. If you wanted to present, you would submit an extended abstract around January or February. And they also have several days of excellent workshops before the conference. So I wanted to highlight that this year in particular, it's in your backyard if you're in the UK, and that might be a great option if you're interested in learning more. But there's also all sorts of resources in here to follow up with. And with that, I'll look forward to your questions later, and I'm going to pass it off to Holly.
Great, thank you, Molly. Just gonna share my slides. Just to double check, can you see the slides? Great, thank you very much, Molly, for that really great intro to SNA. So I'll now go ahead and give some more kind of specific examples of how social network analysis has been used to explore friendship network data among young people in South London. So I'm a third-year PhD student here at the Centre for Society and Mental Health, and my PhD is focused on adolescent self-harm and the role of gender and friendship networks. And some of my work has involved using social network analysis to look at how the structure of adolescent friendship networks might relate to self-harm. So in this presentation, I'll just briefly introduce what the REACH study is, and then I'll describe how the network data was collected, how it was visualized and constructed, and then give some example network metrics that I've used in my PhD. I'll also just mention some of the research questions and analyses that are ongoing with the REACH study. So the Resilience, Ethnicity and Adolescent Mental Health Study, or REACH for short, is an accelerated cohort study of more than 4,000 young people from 12 schools in South London. It was established to examine the extent, nature, and development of mental health problems among young people in inner city London. So 3 representative cohorts of young people aged 11 to 14 years of age were invited to take part at baseline, and they were followed over 1 and 2 year periods. So the adolescents were asked a range of questions about their mental health and their life circumstances, but they were also asked to nominate friends in their year group at their school. So more specifically, we asked the young people to write the first name, last name, and tutor group of up to 5 friends within their year group at their school that they'd spent the most time with in the last 6 months. So each year group in the school constitutes a separate bounded friendship network. Then, using the information stored in the REACH database, these handwritten friendship nominations were matched against the official first and last names of the students at the respective schools. And we also matched it to their unique ID number within the study to make it pseudo-anonymized. So with this data, we turned it into what we call an edge list, and Molly briefly discussed this. So an edge list contains 2 columns of data. The column on the left is the sender column and contains the ID number of the person sending the nominations, and the one on the right is the receiver column and contains the unique ID number of the person that has been nominated. So this is one way that you can kind of store network data, but the other way is to store it as a n by n adjacency matrix. So these are directed friendship nomination data. So in this matrix, a 0 or a 1 represents a friendship tie between people. So for example, if you were to take the row sum of this matrix, you would get somebody's out degree or the number of nominations that you've sent. And if you were to take the column sum, you would end up with somebody's in degree or the number of nominations received by that individual. But as Molly mentioned, a matrix is just one way to store data, but networks are much more intuitively understood when they are mapped out visually into what we call a sociogram. So just briefly, there are lots of different programs for visualizing, but the ones that I'll show you today, I've used the StatNet package in R. So here is an example sociogram of one of our year 7 networks at school 7. So in the sociogram, the circles, often referred to as nodes or vertexes, represent the young people in the network, whereas the arrows, sometimes called edges or ties, represent directed friendship nominations between those young people in the school year group. So when I placed this year 7 network next to a year 8 network of the same school, you can sometimes see there are really interesting structural features that become quite apparent when you map them out. So if you look at the one on the left, we can see there's quite a dense main component where most of the adolescents are friends with each other. But interestingly, we've got some what we call isolate nodes. So these are people that neither send nor receive any friendship nominations in that year group. Whereas if you look to the year 8 network on the right, it's got quite a different structure. So we've got on the right here kind of a separate clique or friendship group off to the right of this main network. So all these friends are friends with each other in this group, but not with the main year group. And interestingly, we have people in what we might call bridging positions. So these people are kind of bridging otherwise disconnected friendship groups in this school year group. And that might be quite an important position to hold in your year group if you're a young person. So as well as mapping them out to look at the structure, you can also color the nodes by attributes. So here is that same year 7 network at school 7, but this time I've colored the nodes by the attributes of the student's gender. So we do find there is very strong gender homophily in the REACH network. So girls tend to prefer girls and boys tend to prefer boys. And interestingly, here is that same network, but this time I've added the attribute of ethnic group. And we also find there's really strong ethnic group homophily within the REACH networks. But as well as kind of just looking at them and adding attributes, social network analysis can be used to compute metrics about the network. So for example, you might be interested in looking at the density of the whole school year group. So density, as Molly briefly mentioned, is this measure of kind of how interconnected a year group might be. So more formally, it is the ratio of actual friendship ties that exist in the network to all possible ties that there could be. So the measure ranges from 0 to 1. So if this network had a density of 0, that would mean there'd be all complete isolate nodes in that network. Whereas if it scored 1, that would mean everybody in this year group is friends with absolutely everybody. So typically with kind of whole year group networks, we find that density tends to be quite low because you often don't have everyone in a school year group who's friends with everybody. But interestingly, you can also compute density at a friendship group level, or this ego network level that Molly was talking about. So for example, you might pick a specific adolescent in the network, so this red node here, and you just look at the one-step network of that adolescent. So that means who they have nominated and who has nominated them, or think of it as kind of their friendship group within this wider school year group. And you can also compute density on friendship groups. So for example, the density of this friendship group is about 0.4. So you can see it's often density is a lot higher for friendship groups than you would find for whole year groups. And then this little clique that we saw in the earlier network, so if you were to take the density of this friendship group, it would equal 1, because everyone in that friendship group are friends with each other and the focal adolescent. But there are other interesting things you can compute. So Molly was talking about kind of positions in a network. So I was interested in looking at who was the most popular person in the network. So this measure of somebody's in degree, or how many nominations somebody receives. So what you can also do with sociograms is you can size the nodes by these metrics. So here is that same year 7 network again, but this time the nodes have been sized by the adolescents in degree. So you can kind of get an idea for who the more popular people are in the network. So those nodes that are larger, and also the people that might not be so popular in the school year group. And another interesting measure that you can compute is called betweenness centrality. So here is a sociogram. This is a year 8 network at one of our schools, but this time I've sized the nodes by betweenness. So you can more conceptually think of betweenness as these kind of young people that bridge otherwise disconnected friendship groups in the network. But more formally, it's how many times an adolescent lies on the shortest path between other young people in the network. So if you were to score not very high in betweenness centrality, this might mean that you are an isolate node, or perhaps you're in a densely connected friendship group. Whereas if you score highly on this measure, it means you're in this kind of quite important position where you're spanning otherwise disconnected people. So that's kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the REACH data and how we collected it, and some visualization. So I'm just going to show you some kind of example research questions and things that have been done with the REACH data so far. So first, I'd like to just mention the work of Dr. Rachel Blakey. So Rachel was the first PhD student to work on the REACH network data, and she did so much of the heavy lifting in terms of the data cleaning. So I was very lucky that when I started my PhD, I could kind of build on the work that Rachel had already started. So Rachel was interested in looking at the development of conduct problems during adolescence using the social network data in REACH. So she used our longitudinal network data. So we collected these friendship nominations over time. And she worked with Dr. Sophia Boda, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Essex, who has expertise in these more kind of dynamic social network models. So Rachel was interested in whether or not conduct problems in adolescence might be socially influenced by friendship groups. So she used this stochastic actor-oriented model, so this state-of-the-art dynamic social network model that can model the coevolution of both friendships and behavior over time. And she was interested in social influence, and these models can tease apart social influence and selection. So do people join friendship groups with people that are similar to them, or do they become influenced by their friends over time? And Rachel did find some kind of interesting findings that do suggest that conduct problems might be socially influenced in the REACH networks. And then my own work, so I've been looking at adolescent self-harm and peer friendship networks, but I've been focusing more on how the structure of young people's friendship networks might relate to self-harm, more specifically looking at kind of network integration, so being too integrated in your networks, these measures of kind of betweenness centrality, or being very, very popular, but also not being very integrated. So the people that are isolates in the network, how does this relate to self-harming behavior? And I've also been interested in looking at being exposed to self-harm within friendship groups. So that's kind of a bit of a tour about REACH. I just thought I'd leave with a couple of key takeaways that I've kind of learned on this journey to learning how to analyze network data. So the first one is just, I guess, careful consideration about collecting data. So as I mentioned, the REACH data were kind of handwritten friendship nominations, which took a long time to match back to the official first and last names, particularly when students use nicknames or names that you can't easily match back. So I think, if possible, to use kind of more electronic methods that already have class lists already on tablets just makes that process so much quicker. And also careful thought around the number of friends that you might allow students to nominate. So in the Reach data set, it was up to 5 friendship nominations. And there kind of are pros and cons for whether you let somebody nominate more friends or not. But I think it's just about weighing up what you think is best. So there have been some studies that show if you let students nominate an unlimited amount, you sometimes get implausibly high number of nominations. So it's just kind of careful thought around the way you word the question and the number of people that you could nominate. And also, I guess, yeah, just taking time to visualize and explore networks is really important. So one, just to ensure that your data cleaning has gone how you've expected. So once you visualize it, does it look how you expect it to look? And also for when you're sense checking, so when you're creating metrics like betweenness centrality that can sometimes seem a little bit abstract, if you map out a network, you can see, okay, there are people that are in these positions, and does it reflect kind of the measures that maybe R or StatNet are kind of printing out to you? So it's just super helpful to visualize them and just get a really good feel for what the networks look like before you go ahead and do kind of any further descriptives or kind of more complicated analyses. And Molly has got an excellent page about all the resources, but I did just want to highlight the Duke Network Analysis Centre lectures, including Molly's lecture on whole network descriptive statistics, which is kind of where I learned how to do most of this work. And it includes R scripts and video lectures as well. And just also a mention about the Essex Summer School in Social Network Analysis. So I took this course 2 years ago. I think it's about a 3-week course where you get an introduction, but also you can go on to do and learn about these kind of more complicated dynamic network models if you want to. And lastly, just wanted to say thank you to my supervisors, Craig, Gemma and Molly, who've been really supportive with this work, and just the whole Reach team, who are the people that kind of went into the schools, collected the network data, and all the young people that took part in Reach. So just gonna stop sharing my screen, but if you have any questions about the network data, then definitely feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Holly and Molly, for a really wonderful, very clear and informative talk on social network analyses, and especially clear because some of the terminology and language is quite difficult, but to have it so clearly set out and explained, I think is really great, but also now provides a really wonderful resource for the centre and for others who want to have an introduction to this field. We've got time for questions and comments and reflections, so please do either indicate, I think, by putting up your hand or put into the chat. I've got some questions I would like to ask, but I'll defer to others first. So Rachel first, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks so much. That was really interesting and really clear, which is what I've been needing in the discussions around social networks, because the language is quite unusual, depending on what background you come from. It's more a question about the data collection on Reach, actually. I'm based at UCL and look at various questions around the mental health of children in the care system. And we're moving towards doing some network mapping. And I guess one of the things that is playing on my mind is the ethics of mapping networks of young people that are very vulnerable to having people in their networks that most people would not think are safe, but they might see as really important. And I guess I wondered on Reach if you had any experience of that, and kind of how you deal with that when you're there to map networks and collect the data on that, but it raises some like safeguarding and ethical concerns, and we're just grappling with that at the moment. So I'd be really interested to hear how you've managed it on your projects.
I think with the Reach data, where you're asking about friendships, I think it's a slightly easier kind of relationship tie to ask people about. So I don't know if Molly, if you have, I know this has come up before about kind of the ethics of like asking questions about other people's friends and things like that. So in terms of Reach, I guess, yeah, I think the ethics process was just, it didn't involve asking about anything other than friendship ties. So I don't think we had to kind of think too hard on the ethics bit about that. But yeah, I don't know, Molly, if you have any thoughts about other studies.
Yeah, I think in general, there's a couple of concerns, right? Like anytime you're collecting network data, it's a lot harder to keep promises of anonymity.
Yeah,
because
that's what we're struggling with, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think one big difference is if you have egocentric or sociocentric data, right? And to some extent, if you have sociocentric data, you already know the roster, right? Like if it's naming your friends in school, we already know who the kids in school are. And like Holly said, a lot of it depends on the question. So if it's friendship, if it's support, those tend to be much less of a concern than if it's something like bullying or like a negative behavior. Like, you know, usually IRBs, so the boards that would review the ethics here for your research in the US, they balk if you ask like, who hates people, right? Like that's not going to work. But if you ask like, who supports you, some kind of more positively valenced question, that might help. Now, if you have egocentric data, so if it's not just kids in school, but like, you know, kids who have contact with some sort of system, and you're just asking about their individual networks and it's not being connected further, on the one hand, that's easier to maintain anonymity, right? Because it's not we're not drawing from a set roster of individuals. And so if they're just naming, you know, they don't even have to give names. Maybe they just give initials and then they say, oh, this person supports me and this is their age and, you know, whatever else might be helpful, their age, their gender, whatever other attribute information you want to connect. On that hand, it's almost more anonymous. It's harder to identify who those individuals are. You still likely have concerns about the type of relationship you're eliciting. And if you are expecting it's something that would need some kind of like ethical reporting, like if just like any other question, if you hear something, you know, about abuse or something like that, you have the same concerns that you would have if that were reported for other questions that weren't about networks. So I do think there's
anonymity is anonymity, sorry, essential for network data?
I think it's just like any other survey data, right? That we want people to participate, and part of how we do that is saying that it's going to be anonymous, right? So it's often like very practically, like those are the high level concerns. Very practically, usually what happens is if you're in a school setting, you have people write down their names. Those names get converted to unique IDs and they get separated, and then from there on, you work with the unique IDs. So you might not know that Molly named Holly as a friend. You know that person 100 named person 101, right? And so you preserve the anonymity.
I can see if the network all sits within the school, like, it is a bit more clear. But that it's helpful. I think we'll just keep thinking
and you can apply the same thing with IDs for egocentric data as well, right? There's no reason you can't. You're not drawing from the same roster, but you could still have attribute information. To some extent, you're not going to match those people. So their ID almost doesn't matter. You just need the attributes about them or the other information you want, right? It doesn't matter. It matters if it's ego network data. It matters if I named 3 people, not who those 3 people are, because you're not going to go survey them or match them anyway in most cases. Right now, you might have an interesting setting where there's a bit more kind of cross contact between them and there could be matching, right? So there's all sorts of variation within that. But I think it's sets of ethical questions that we would have just for kind of any other survey data, and the same process of creating unidentifiable information, and then just thinking about kind of the ethical process of, well, what are we eliciting? Is this going to do harm to our respondents to elicit it?
Yeah, and I guess then if you can't, the problem is we obviously have to safeguard. So if you cannot promise a child that you can keep the information they're giving you safe, does that ruin the point of doing a social network map? I guess is the question that we're grappling with.
Yeah, I think it's like
there's no clear answer.
Yeah, and it's like any other question you'd ask on your survey. There's probably other survey questions you ask where you're not sure if they're going to tell you the truth, if there's mandatory reporting, etc. So in that sense, it's not different because it's a network. Yeah.
Thank you. Really, really interesting talks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Appreciate your question. Nastasia, do you want to go next?
Yes, I have a question. But first of all, the talk was very amazing. It's quite refreshing to see people working with social network in schools, because I know it's difficult. I did by myself. So I'm a research fellow in Singapore, and we did a data collection in a school, in a local school here. And one thing that we had, it was missing data because of consent. So we cannot use data from students that we do not have parental consent. I guess this is typical from any place. So how did you have this kind of experience in your project, and how did you deal with this matter? Because it affects the network structure. So I'm just curious. on your procedures about it?
Yeah, I think that is something that I discovered and wasn't entirely sure how to deal with, but it's kind of how Molly was saying, kind of you deal with it like you would any kind of missing data. So obviously it does impact the network. So with the visualizations that I've shown you, that's the entire web of people that could exist. But you'll notice when I color them by attribute, some of them might have had missing data on there. So even though we know the whole structure, you're right in saying that if there are students that have kind of withdrawn from the study or are missing data, that they don't end up being. So for example, when I was using data for my study, anyone that was missing data kind of doesn't get counted in my metric. So it does affect the networks in a way if you have lots of missing data. Same for when I was computing. So I was talking about isolate nodes in the network. And sometimes I was visualizing networks and I would see there's lots of isolates, and that's not because they're truly isolates. They don't truly have no friends. It's because they weren't present on the day. So there definitely are some kind of things that you need to think about in terms of missing data. But I think it's still, although it impacts the network to an extent, you can still get really useful things from networks, even with people that have missing data or that have withdrawn from the study. It's still important to look at the web. But yeah, I don't know, Molly, if you have anything else to add to that.
I would just add, and I was Googling to get my terminology correct while Holly was talking, and I didn't find what I was looking for, but this is a common concern. And so there are a lot of people that work specifically on using simulation methods to gauge the extent to which missing data is affecting the network. So I would look for some of those resources too, that it is a common problem. And in that sense, it's almost become a research question in and of itself. Like, to what extent do we think this is driving what we're observing? What would be different? And there's also work that shows some measures are more robust than others. So like betweenness, for example, is quite fragile to missing data because you might look like you're spanning groups, but you're really not. And other measures might be more robust. So there are tools for assessing the extent to which this might be shaping your data. And there's kind of more advanced tools too, to use different simulations like ergms to try and impute missing data for networks, or at least gauge the extent to which it might be driving what you observe.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks, Holly. Just a question about the data, because I guess it's clearly hugely challenging to generate this data and then to manage and work with this type of data. And so I guess for people who are listening and thinking about questions that they might want to address that would use this sort of data. So can I guess a couple of things. Are there data sets available for people to analyze that are kind of accessible, where they don't necessarily need to do these sorts of studies themselves? I guess that's one element to it. The second is this makes sense to me in terms of schools and possibly workplaces. Of course, there are limits around that, but could you give a sense, or do you have a sense of what other types of sort of bounded networks you could generate this information on, and what are the settings that kind of data has been generated from or could be generated from?
I'll go quickly, and then I'm sure Holly can jump in. So there's absolutely secondary data. A lot of the times it's for sociocentric data. It's not publicly available, and you have to get kind of permission and go through a process to access it, but it is accessible. So in the US, for example, we have the AdHealth data, which have networks. I know there's a lot of sociocentric data being collected in the Netherlands from different universities and researchers there, in Belgium, in Hungary, just for some examples that are local. And then ego-centric data is much more kind of publicly available. So you have those wider international, national surveys that have that. And so in terms of where the bounded sociocentric data is collected outside of schools, I think that there's there are some sets of other settings where we might think of that kind of physical boundary. So for example, companies and workplaces, or even some people are collecting these data now in older adult communities. So kind of like retirement communities or nursing homes or things like that. So other places where you might think people are kind of physically, co-residing in ways that lead to these types of networks. I just also want to put a plug out there for existing kind of archival data, like with the internet now, right? Anytime we have anything that's interconnected, it could be a network. So you can be asking network questions without having to go survey people or even using secondary data that's surveying people. And so I think if we broaden our view a little bit, there's a lot that you could do with networks that might get at your research question that isn't reliant on collecting data or access to secondary data.
Thanks, Molly. I don't know, Holly, if you got anything to add to that.
Only just to say that, yeah, I think, like you say, there are lots of these data sets, but often, so for example, when I was looking at what studies exist that have friendship networks, but also self-harm data, that was kind of the extra bit, which is you might have the sociometric data, but does it have the rest of the information that you want to measure in that network? So I think that's also important.
Great, thanks, Holly. Thanks, Molly. So I think unless there are any final burning questions, I think we're at the end of the time that we have available to us. And just to say a huge thank you to Molly and in particular Holly, who is in the midst of writing up her PhD, and so to take the time out to talk today about the about social network analyses is something that we're hugely grateful for. Before you all leave, we ask you to complete a feedback poll, which will pop up on your screens in a moment. So please, if you could take a minute or so to complete this, it just helps us kind of inform the content and running these sessions going forward. So hopefully you can all see that. Thank you very much, everyone. And just to finally say that we really appreciate you joining these. We hope that they feel of use and of value. This certainly has felt hugely informative to me. The next session, our final session of 2023, is on realist evaluation, which will take place on the 6th of December, and we'll be sending out details soon for that. So very much hope to also see you at that. And just a final thanks to Holly and Molly for a really wonderful session. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining.